It was the evening of August 22, 1990, in Houston, Texas, when 22-year-old Cheryl Henry and 21-year-old Garland Andy Atkinson decided to go out for a night of dancing. They were young, they were in love, and by all accounts, the night started beautifully. Cheryl had earlier spent time with her sister, the two of them out drinking and laughing, but as the evening wore on, her sister headed home while Cheryl stayed behind with Andy. The two of them drove together through the warm Houston night, and at some point, they parked Andy's white Honda Civic in a quiet, secluded cul-de-sac near the 1300 block of Enclave Parkway in West Houston, a spot locals had long called Lover's Lane, a place where young couples came to be alone, away from the noise of the city. Nobody knows exactly what happened next, but what we do know is that neither Cheryl nor Andy ever went home that night. When Cheryl didn't show up for work the following morning, her family grew alarmed. They filed a missing person report with the Houston Police Department. Then, on the morning of August 23, 1990, a security guard conducting a routine patrol noticed something wrong. Andy's white Honda Civic was still parked at the end of that cul-de-sac, exactly where it had been for hours, and it hadn't moved. The guard approached the car and noticed a purse sitting on the passenger side floorboard. Inside the purse was Cheryl Henry's ID. He immediately called the police. Officers arrived and began searching the surrounding area. In the nearby woods, hidden beneath a pile of wooden boards in what investigators described as a deliberate attempt to conceal a body, they found Cheryl. She had been sexually assaulted and her throat had been cut. Andy's body was found shortly after. He too had been bound and his throat had been slashed. Both of them had been murdered in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, left in the dark woods while the rest of the city slept. The crime scene shook the Houston Police Department. Investigators collected evidence, took statements, and worked the case hard in the days and weeks that followed. But despite their best efforts, no suspect was ever identified. The case went cold. Years passed. Detectives came and went. The families of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson waited for answers that never came. Then, in 2008, nearly 18 years after the murders, investigators made a partial breakthrough. A DNA profile extracted from evidence collected at Cheryl's autopsy was linked to a separate rape case in the National CODIS database, the combined DNA index system used by law enforcement across the United States. The DNA profile was there, sitting in the database, pointing to someone, but investigators still didn't have a name to attach to it. The person behind the DNA remained a ghost. The case went cold again. Another decade and a half crawled by. In 2025, the Harris County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit revisited the file. Investigators were going through old tips, old leads, old threads that had never been fully pulled, when something caught their attention. A tip had been submitted naming a man called Floyd William Parrott. Investigators began digging. They discovered that Parrott, who was 28 years old at the time of the murders in 1990, had been working at a job site approximately 1 mile from Enclave Parkway the very day the bodies were discovered. Public records placed him firmly in the Houston area throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Court records showed that in May of 1988, just 2 years before the murders, Parrott had been arrested for impersonating a police officer. He had a habit of posing as law enforcement, driving around the Houston area in what prosecutors later described as a fake cop car, pulling people over, asserting authority he did not have. He had multiple arrests in Harris County during those years, impersonating a peace officer, carrying a weapon, and in 1995 he was sentenced to prison, eventually released on parole in 1999. But the most critical piece of evidence came when investigators took the DNA tip and cross-referenced it with the CODIS database. They discovered that DNA from a 1996 sexual assault case, in which Parrott had been identified as a suspect, was a match to the swabs taken from Cheryl Henry's sexual assault exam during her autopsy. A second DNA connection was also found, linking Parrott to a separate sexual assault reported in June of 1990, just 2 months before Cheryl and Andy were killed. The DNA didn't lie. The evidence was overwhelming. In March of 2026, the Houston Police Department and the FBI moved quickly. An FBI SWAT team tracked Floyd William Parrott to Lincoln, Nebraska, where he had been living for years. He was 64 years old now, decades removed from the night he had allegedly driven to that quiet cul-de-sac in West Houston and taken 2 young lives. When officers arrested him, Parrott reportedly told police he had never even met Cheryl Henry. He was charged with capital murder and held in a Nebraska jail while Harris County authorities began the extradition process. At a press conference, Harris County District Attorney Sean Tier stood before reporters and said these unsolved murders had weighed incredibly heavy on 2 families and on the community for more than 3 decades. He revealed that over 100 persons of interest had been examined over the years, that multiple detectives had worked the case through the decades, and yet Parrott had somehow never been among the hundreds of people interviewed. Tier also warned the public that investigators believe there may be more victims out there, that Parrott's habit of impersonating law enforcement may have allowed him to commit other crimes against other people who had never come forward. Authorities released photographs of Parrott from 1990, asking anyone who may have been falsely pulled over by him to contact police. Cheryl Henry's younger sister, Shane Craig, attended the press conference and wept quietly as officials spoke. When she stepped to the microphone, she said, "Our sister was taken in a way that no one should experience. She was more than a victim in a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a person who brought much love and light to our lives." But the story did not end in a courtroom. Floyd Parrott was challenging his extradition to Texas, exercising his legal right to fight the process. Then, in late April of 2026, just days after a grand jury formally indicted him, Parrott died in his Nebraska jail cell. Preliminary investigations indicated he had taken his own life. He was gone before he could ever face a trial, before Cheryl's family could ever have a day in court, before Andy's loved ones could ever hear a verdict. The Harris County DA's office released a statement saying that Floyd William Parrott thought he could outrun the truth, that he thought time would erase his past, but prosecutors and investigators never stopped working the case. The statement went on to say that since his arrest, new survivors had come forward, bravely reliving the horrors he had inflicted upon them, and that investigators were already in Louisiana pursuing another cold case linked to Parrott. The case of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson, 2 young people who went out dancing one warm August evening and never came home, was finally broken open after nearly 36 years, only to be robbed of its final chapter by the death of the one man who could have answered every remaining question. The families were denied their day in court. But the truth, at least in part, had finally come to light.